Beneath the canopy of Appalachia's silent hills, there are stories whispered but never written, tales so grotesque they bleed into legend. Imagine a young girl born into a family where bloodlines never met outsiders, where the faces of her parents were also the faces of her siblings, and where the word marriage was nothing more than a cycle of repetition, one that erased the difference between mother, sister, and wife. Her name has been lost, deliberately hidden, yet her existence remains a scar carved into the backwoods. She was the daughter of incest, the sister in a twisted lineage, and the wife to her own blood. In her body, generations of repetition met their breaking point. This is not just the story of one child. It is the story of what happens when isolation becomes a prison, when shame becomes tradition, and when a family turns inward until there is no way out. The land itself carried the silence of her life. Cabins swallowed by vines, abandoned cemeteries where stones tilted like broken teeth, and voices from within that never saw the light of law or church. She grew up not knowing the difference between family ties and chains. To her, the man who fathered her was also her brother by blood. To her, the woman who raised her was both mother and half-sister. And as she came of age, she was expected to step into a role already mapped out long before her birth. Becoming a wife, not to a stranger, but to the same web of blood that birthed her. There was no choice. There was no future. There was only the circle. Her childhood face carried the deformities of repetition, a jaw too small, eyes that drifted in opposite directions, skin pale and fragile, as if even the blood inside her carried the exhaustion of too many cycles. When she laughed, it was thin, almost hollow, a sound more unsettling than joyful. When she cried, there was no one to comfort her, for everyone's, nay, in that cabin knew the same fate awaited them all. What makes her story unbearable is not simply what happened to her, but that she never knew anything else. Imagine growing up believing that love only meant possession, that family only meant repetition, and that your destiny was written not in hope, but in blood already too close. She lived, she married within her own, and she bore children who carried the weight of her own deformities, children who would, in turn, continue the same cycle. This is the story that Appalachia tries to forget, but the land does not let go. The earth holds memory, and in these forgotten valleys, the truth seeps out through silence. She was born in a cabin that seemed older than time itself, its wood warped and darkened by generations of smoke and sorrow. The air inside was heavy, as if grief had soaked into the walls. Every crack in the floorboards whispered history, and none of it was kind. Her earliest memories were not of play or innocence, but of a world where the boundaries between roles were blurred beyond recognition. She watched her mother, herself a daughter, a sister and a wife, move like a shadow, resigned to a fate she had never chosen. It was from this woman that she learned what her own life would inevitably become. From the moment she was old enough to understand speech, her ears were filled with words of obedience, silence and fear. Outsiders were not to be trusted, neighbors were to be avoided, and the family itself was the only circle she was allowed to know. The isolation was not just physical but spiritual. There was no church bell to call them to worship, no schoolhouse to open her mind, no neighbors to offer another way of life. The cabin was both cradle and coffin, and every child born there was already trapped. The deformities of her bloodline were visible long before she reached adulthood. Her body bore the signs of too much sameness. Crooked teeth, a sloping forehead, a gait that looked fragile even when she tried to walk strong. Yet within those deformities was something even more haunting, an innocence that did not know it was cursed. She smiled at her brothers, who were also her uncles. She clung to her sisters, who were also her aunts. And when the time came, she was guided toward a role that was not love, but obligation. Her wedding was no celebration. There were no flowers, no dresses, no music. There was only the silent acceptance of something passed down like a family heirloom, a tradition never written, but always obeyed. She became a wife, not because she wanted Ed too, but because she was told there was no other way. The man she was given to was her own kin, a face she had known since birth, a man who carried the same twisted lineage inside him. It was not romance nor partnership. It was the tightening of a circle that had already begun long before her. And so she carried life within her, children born not out of love, but out of ritual, children who bore her face, her brother's face, her father's face, all blurred together until identity itself collapsed. These children were not merely offspring, they were echoes of the same blood, recycled again and again, each generation weaker, more fragile, and more haunted than the last. The whispers that escaped those mountains were always half-believed, passed from one town to another like a ghost story. Neighbors would speak of the family in the hollow, the ones who never came into town, the ones whose children seemed touched by something not quite natural. They would describe faces that looked familiar yet wrong, as if human features had been rearranged by invisible hands. Crooked jaws, vacant stares, and speech so broken it was more noise than language. People said the family lived like animals, but that was never the full truth. They lived like prisoners of their own blood. The daughter, who was sister and wife, became the center of those whispers. When she appeared on rare occasions, emerging from the woods like a pale apparition, her presence unsettled everyone. Her eyes, never quite aligned, carried both a childish confusion and an ancient exhaustion. Her mouth twisted, as though forming words that never fully came out. Strangers would avert their gaze, not because she was monstrous, but because she reflected something people did not want to acknowledge, the result of abandonment, neglect, and a society that looked the other way. But behind her fragile frame, there was endurance. She woke each day to the same cabin walls, to the same faces, to the same roles that stripped her of identity. She cooked, cleaned, bore children, and silently obeyed. In her silence was the weight of generations, and in her body was the proof of what happens when bloodlines collapse into themselves. She had become not just a woman, but a vessel of a cycle too dark to name. As the years passed, her children grew, and their deformities grew with them. Some could barely form words, others could barely walk straight. Yet each of them carried the same fate awaiting them, to marry within, to repeat what their mother had endured. She must have known, on some level, that her daughters would become her mirror, and her sons would become the very men who bound her life. But what choice did she have? There was no road leading out of the hollow, only deeper into it. The community nearby knew of them, but kept their distance. It was easier to pretend they didn't exist, to dismiss them as backwoods degenerates, rather than confront the horror of what isolation and silence can create. And so the family remained hidden, tucked away in the Appalachian wilderness, their suffering unseen, their legacy whispered but never confronted. Her life became less about survival and more about endurance, a cycle carried forward in shadows while the outside world went on, unaware or unwilling to see. The deeper you look into her story, the more it feels less like a life and more like a curse unraveling across generations. Every branch of her family tree bent back onto itself until it formed a closed loop, a circle that strangled growth. She was both product and participant, a daughter who had no choice but to become her own mother's reflection. When she bore children, it was not the beginning of something new. It was the recycling of the same blood, the same deformities, the same suffering repeated like an echo that refused to fade. Historians who have stumbled upon these hidden cases describe them in clinical terms: genetic bottlenecks, autosomal recessive disorders, the collapse of diversity. But behind the medical language lies something more haunting, a psychological imprisonment where no one can imagine escape. To her, there was no concept of a different future. Outsiders spoke of marriage and choice, but in that cabin, those words meant nothing. A wife was simply the next link in a chain of flesh. A daughter was only waiting her turn, and love was irrelevant. Her face carried the unmistakable signs of her bloodline's collapse: the high, uneven forehead, the eyes that never truly aligned, the jaw too narrow for her teeth. Her voice was quiet, often garbled, sometimes impossible to understand, and yet, despite the deformities, she remained deeply human, a woman with feelings, however stifled, a woman who knew pain but was never given the language to express it. In her silence, she embodied the tragedy of being trapped by one's own family. Her husband, her brother, her kin, was not a villain in the traditional sense. He too was a victim, born into the same endless cycle, molded by the same isolation. Together they raised children who became siblings and cousins at the same time, roles stacked until meaning dissolved. It was not love that bound them, but inevitability. And still, outsiders turned their faces away. Officials knew but rarely interfered. To acknowledge her story would be to confront the failure of an entire society, a reminder that neglect can breed horrors far worse than poverty alone. Instead, her life was left to rot in silence, a secret buried in the hills. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have run? Or would you too have been swallowed by the silence? Next section. As she aged, her body bore the toll of a life forged in repetition. Each pregnancy weakened her further, her bones thinning, her skin growing papery and pale. Her children, many sickly, some barely surviving infancy, clung to her as though she were both mother and prison. She carried them in silence, rocking them in the same corner of the cabin where she herself had once been rocked, where her mother had rocked her before. Generations of women, all trapped in the same chair, performing the same role, bound by the same blood. In that silence, there was no rebellion, no outcry. The family did not scream against their fate. They accepted it as though it were written in the soil. The outside world was not simply far away, it was forbidden, made terrifying by stories passed down to keep them compliant. They were told that outsiders mocked them, that the world beyond the hills was cruel, that their only safety was inside the circle of kin. Fear became a fence taller than any wall, and within it, she remained. Her children grew, and soon the cycle repeated again. Daughters led to brothers, sons leading sisters. The family tree collapsed inward until it no longer resembled a tree at all, but a knot, a tangled, suffocating knot. And through it all she endured, a figure half forgotten even by those around her. To them, she was not a person with dreams. She was a vessel, an inevitability, a continuation of what had always been. The deformities deepened with each generation. Some of her children could not form words at all, communicating in grunts, moans, or gestures. Others bore faces so warped that neighbors whispered about unnatural creatures in the woods. They were not monsters, but they were the physical embodiment of silence stretching across decades. Every sloping forehead, every crooked smile, every hollow stare was proof of what happens when a family refuses, or is forced to remain within itself. And she knew it. In the rare, quiet moments, staring into the cracked mirror nailed to the cabin wall, she saw herself reflected not as a woman, but as a lineage collapsing in slow motion. Her face was her mother's, her husband's, her children's. The same features repeated over and over, like a haunting that could not be exorcised. She was a sister, a wife, a mother, but above all, she was a prisoner of blood. By the time her story reached its quietest chapter, she had become more myth than woman. Outsiders who caught glimpses of her described her as ghostlike, drifting through the woods with eyes that never seemed to focus. Some swore her voice echoed strangely, as if carrying both a child's broken syllables and an old woman's whisper at the same time. Others claimed she would vanish if you stared too long, retreating back into the trees, into the cabin that swallowed every generation whole. But those who lived closest knew she was real. They heard the cries of her children in the night, sharp and unsettling, rising from that hollow like the sounds of trapped animals. They saw her figure moving through the yard, stooped but unbroken, carrying water, chopping wood, feeding mouths that were never truly satisfied. She was not a phantom, she was flesh and bone, but her existence had become so entwined with the cycle that she seemed less like an individual and more like an emblem of what happens when a family is left to collapse in on itself. What makes her story unbearable is not just the deformities, not just the incest, but the fact that no hand ever reached into that hollow to pull her out. Generations of silence, generations of turning away, allowed her life to unfold without interruption. To speak of her was shameful, to acknowledge her was uncomfortable, and so she remained buried alive within her own bloodline. The cabin became both her sanctuary and her tomb, each year pressing her deeper into anonymity. And yet, the land remembers. Even now, the hollow where she lived carries an uneasy stillness. Locals pass by quickly, as though afraid the trees themselves might whisper the truth. The cabin eventually rotted into the earth, its wood collapsing into damp soil, but its memory lingers. Travelers claim they feel watched when they step too close, that they hear the shoe. Careful of bare feet on wooden floors long gone. Whether ghost or memory, the presence of her story clings to the place. She was a daughter, a sister, a wife, and a mother. But more than anything, she was proof of what silence breeds. Her life, erased from records but burned into rumor, is a warning that neglect does not disappear. It festers in the dark, and sometimes it grows into something too twisted to forget. Her end was not marked by violence nor by rescue, but by the same silence that had defined her entire existence. She grew old in the hollow, her body worn thin by childbirth, by labor, by the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders. When she finally passed, there was no funeral, no preacher, no carved stone to remember her name. She was laid in the family plot beside others who had lived the same way, buried in earth that had long ago absorbed their secrets. Grass grew over her grave, and within a year there was nothing to mark the life she had endured. And yet, her legacy did not vanish. Her children carried it forward, and their children after them. Each generation became a living reminder of her fate. To outsiders, they were whispers of deformity and madness hidden in the hills. To themselves, they were only continuing what had always been. That is the true horror, not that one woman lived this way, but that the cycle stretched beyond her, refusing to end even with her death. Some say the bloodline has thinned out, scattered into nearby towns, diluted by chance encounters with outsiders. Others claim the family still lives in that hollow, hidden from view, their features so twisted by repetition that they no longer resemble the people who came before. Whether fact or folklore, one truth remains unshakable. The story of the daughter who was also sister and wife is more than a tale of inbreeding. It is the story of what happens when society abandons its most isolated, when shame takes the place of intervention, and when silence becomes more powerful than compassion. The hills of Appalachia are full of forgotten families, names erased from records, cabins swallowed by trees. But the earth does not forget. It holds memory the way scars hold pain, and in certain places you can feel it still, the echo of lives lived in shadow, the weight of secrets buried, too deep to rot. Her story is not only about her, but about us, about what we allow to fester when we turn our faces away. If you've listened this far, then you've walked with me through the hollow where she lived. You've looked at the life she never chose, the fate she could never escape. And perhaps you feel it too, that unease, that quiet horror that lingers when the story ends but refuses to let you go. Because the truth is this: some lives are forgotten but not erased, and some secrets once uncovered change the way we see the land forever.